Couple of quick questions. How many of you have a favorite sports team? Cool. How many of you have a favorite restaurant or a favorite place to go and eat? Absolutely, all of us do. We all have a favorite this or a favorite that. We really, really do. One of the things I learned in my 28 years as a high school band director, and gosh, it was hard for me to imagine that I spent 28 years relying on the success of teenagers to put food on my table. But one of the things I learned in 28 years as a high school band director is that, well, it's hard not to have favorites when you're a high school band director. It really, I mean, you're frantically trying to get ready for a football show on Friday night. You're frantically trying to get ready for a UIL marching contest, and you've got 150 teenagers out there, and you're just trying your best to get that show ready. The deadline is in front of you. I mean, Friday comes awfully fast when you're a high school band director. And you've got this one group of students. I mean, they're gung-ho. They show up for practice almost running and sprinting to the practice field. When it's time to hit formation, they're there. When the first whistle blows, I mean, they're jumping on it. They've got their music. They don't forget anything. And they may clown around a little bit, they may horse around a little bit, but when it's time to get serious, they dig in and they're there. And then you've got this other group of students. And they're wonderful, lovely kids, but you know, all of a sudden, when that first whistle blows, they want to go, was that for me? And can I go back to the band hall and get my music, please? I forgot it. Or can't we march tomorrow? It's awfully hot today. Tomorrow might be cooler. The grass is wet today. Chances are it'll be dry tomorrow. It's always, can we wait till tomorrow? It's hard not to have favorites when you're a high school band director. It's hard not to have favorites, but indeed it happens. And if I had any thought of trying to convince you good people this morning that are gathered here in worship in seasons to not have favorites, that thought left my mind when the sun came up at 6:46 this morning. What I hope to do this morning is to ask you to seriously consider. I'd like to ask you to seriously consider something else. I would like to ask you not to play favorites for at least 10 minutes. Or maybe a little longer, because this sermon might run over 10 minutes today. I'd like for you to seriously consider not playing favorites for maybe 10 days or even for the rest of your life. Do your level best not to show favoritism, not to play favorites. Obey the law of love and treat others in a manner that is consistent with the way you want to be treated. In a manner in which you would like to see your best friend, maybe your children or your grandchildren treated. I'd like to ask you to simply do your best not to favor one person over another by the way you meet them, by the way in which you speak to them, the way in which you pray for them, the way in which you love them, by the way in which you judge their positions on religious, on political, and social issues. It was the founder of our faith, the Reverend John Wesley, who told his people, begin first by doing no harm. Don't do any harm. And I know that my mouth has gotten me in too much hot water through the years. I say things and do things sometimes that just flat hurt people's feelings. And sometimes I've been guilty of not only having favorites, but of showing favoritism. James is a pastor in the first century. We know that. You've heard me say that many times. And he's barking at his church there in Jerusalem. He's hammering home a sermon that he's probably used many times before. And I bet people are walking out of the door of his service. And I bet they're mumbling to one another, hey, didn't he preach that sermon just last week? Haven't we heard Pastor Ron talk about these kind of things before? And the week before? And after a moment or two of the silence, maybe someone in the crowd says, well, yeah, we have, but I don't know. Maybe he's just waiting for us to do something about it before he goes on to the next topic. James is hammering on this subject for one simple reason. People were playing favorites. Not just having favorites, they were showing favoritism in his church. And pay attention, particular attention, to the kind of favoritism this hinges on. It's the kind of favoritism that hinges on money and power. The rich and famous had been labeled most favored status. I wonder what kind of a label was stamped on the poor. What's the big deal, we ask sometimes, of playing favorites, of showing favoritism? Why does this topic come up time and time again in Scripture? The short answer is this, that when we favor one person over another, we are treating one person as more valuable than another. And that's not Christ-like. That makes no sense in a kingdom of equally precious children of God. We're going to be going to prayer time in just a little bit. We're going to be taking a moment to lift up joys and concerns. And one of the concerns we're going to put on our plate this morning is what happened in San Antonio early this morning, when authorities discovered a truck in a parking lot at Walmart that had bring in human trafficking, and at least 8 people have been found dead in that trailer truck already, many more injured. And cameras show that through the night, cars were coming and going into that parking lot, picking up people and taking them who knows where. The I-10 corridor. The I-10 corridor, just right down the road from where we sit this morning, is one of the heaviest traveled corridors in the United States for human trafficking. Most favored status. One person more valuable than another. That is not the way of Christian people. If you'll think back for a moment, Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, he tells this really great story in his Gospel. It's one that you probably remember. He describes an event that when people were bringing children to Jesus, they probably wanted Jesus to bless them. It was something that families did during that time. If a traveling rabbi or a traveling teacher was going through, they would love to come and bring the children for a blessing. And that's what parents were doing that one day. Jesus had been teaching and he had been talking about divorce and adultery, and then the people started bringing their children forward, wanting Jesus to touch them. And what happened? You remember that story? Yeah. The rabbi police showed up in the forms of the disciples. They were aggravated. They didn't want the children closing in on Jesus. They tried to keep them away. Why? What was going on? We can't be totally sure, but there they are. They're fussing and they're fuming, and they're trying to send the kids away. Part of it had to do with something we might call most valued status. Women and children in that day and time, they did not have the status that others had. They were not valued they were not considered as valuable. And so, maybe they thought Jesus was needing, I don't know. Maybe they thought Jesus had more important things to tend to. I don't know. But maybe it had something to do with this most favored status. I don't know. But whatever they were thinking, Jesus promptly let them know that he wasn't happy with their actions. He wasn't happy about what they were doing. He was angry and he was indignant. And he wanted the children to have full access to him. Jesus was not going to play favorites. I don't know about you, but Mark's Gospel constantly challenges me. I think it challenges all of us. Our self-interested, me-first attitudes. Our almost always, well, that's hard to say to you. I'm almost always right attitude about discipleship. Sometimes we want to follow Jesus, but we want to do it on our terms. We want to define who Jesus should like and who Jesus should keep at arm's length. We sit in judgments of others, and we fail to notice the problems and the sins of our own life. We have our own short list of those that we consider unclean, the ones we don't want to touch our lives in any way. Maybe some are physically, emotionally, financially, or even personally challenged. The Reverend John Wesley was deeply troubled by that kind of a self-absorption because it gave rise to a form of bigotry. It was an attitude, it was a way of looking at others that failed to take into account just how wide God's love and mercy truly were. All too often, we want to narrow the scope of God's grace. We want to limit it just a bit. And I've got to wonder how God feels about that. I'm not sure that's what the disciples were doing that day when they tried to keep the children from getting too close to Jesus. I'm not sure that's exactly what was happening in James's church that day he preached that sermon to his folks. But I think they might have been headed in that direction. John Wesley challenged his followers then, and John Wesley challenges us today to live a life of radical discipleship that overcomes that kind of bigotry. For the disciples of that day and time in Mark's gospel, it was the children who needed to be sent away. For some of us, it might be the homeless, ex-convicts, refugees. There's always someone. I was amazed. I found a book at the house that I was looking for. And I was amazed because often when I go looking for a book that I want specifically, it's either at the church or it's been loaned out or something, but I actually found it. There's a book I wanted to glance at again. It's one I've mentioned before in one of my sermons. The book is entitled, listen carefully to the title of this, How Jesus Saves the World from Us. Let that title sink in. How Jesus Saves the World from Us. The author of that book is Morgan Guyton. He's an elder in the United Methodist Church. And he reflects that some of the loudest voices in Christianity today sound a little bit like the religious authorities did, who did everything they could think of to silence Jesus. And when they couldn't silence him, they crucified him. I'm going to say that again. The author reflects that some of the loudest voices in Christianity today sound a little bit like the religious authorities that did everything they could to silence Jesus. And when they couldn't, they crucified him. Our Christian culture has been subjected often to a toxic dose of bad theology. And it's been subjected to that bad theology for so long that we're almost immune to the poison sometimes. The author of this book begins with a question at the very beginning of his book that it should at least call for a moment or two of reflection before we answer it. He asks, have Christians become what Jesus came to stop us from being? Have we as Christians become sometimes what Jesus came to stop us from being? I think truly the answer to that question is what had James so stirred up the day he hammered his congregation about favoritism. Remember this, we are followers of Christ. We are the people of the way. And sometimes we just don't do a very good job of representing Jesus to the world. Was that happening that day with the apostles so very long ago? If they could decide that the children could be sent away, then who else might be on that list? And as for me, that's not a game I want to play. Jesus told the disciples to get over themselves. He said, let the children go. He said, don't throw up detour signs or roadblocks. James told his congregation to quit playing favorites. He said, quit giving special attention to the rich and the powerful. Remember this, the last thing this world needs is another spiritual bully. And the last thing we need is to become one ourselves. For that I say to God alone be the glory.